Good evening. I'm Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times. Thank you. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this extraordinary evening here at Town Hall. This year marks the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, and it was on this very day in 1969 that man first walked to the moon. In the next 90 minutes, we will hear from men and women who made this happen, as well as icons of our current space program. We start with the first ever reading of Tony Award-winning playwright J.T. Rogers' latest work, One Giant Leap. Commissioned for this occasion, the play was created from the transcripts of the Apollo 11 mission, excerpts from New York Times articles of the day, and interviews with people who made the moon landing a reality. Later, Michael Barbaro, longtime New York Times reporter and host of our podcast, The Daily, will talk on stage with three luminaries of America's space program. I'll speak more about our guests after the play. In just a moment, we'll be joined on stage by some of this country's finest film and theater actors. But before they come out, I want to call out one of our own stars who is with us tonight in the audience, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter John Noble Wilford, who's over there someplace. 50 years ago, John covered the Apollo missions and became part of our legendary Science Times, now in its 41st year. Putting out the New York Times isn't quite as complicated an undertaking as sending people to the moon. But we do it every day, and we have done it so far for 168 years. We're almost as old as the moon itself. Journalists are explorers in a way. We want to know what's out there and to get to the bottom of things in politics, culture, science, and human affairs generally. We strive to bring you the human endeavor, its triumphs, and its painful failures. We like to think that with your help as readers, every day and every article brings us all in one small step closer to the truth. And with that, please join me in welcoming the cast of One Giant Leap. Thank you.
My heart was beating. I knew I didn't want to make any mistakes. This was the day that I was born for.
I've been known to describe it as sheer terror.
A lunar flight. It's a fragile daisy chain.
Once you left Earth behind, would your social system fall apart? Would your mind be blown?
We were committing these guys. Once they left Earth orbit, it had to work. If it broke in a serious way, they were not going to survive.
It's a hostile environment. We're not meant to be there.
Its gravity is 1/6 Earth's gravity. It has no air, no moisture. This heavenly body has never seen an earthling or felt a footstep. It's Sunday, July 20, 1969. Today, we will land on the moon.
You want me to say it in my words? All right. I am John Noble Wilford. I was the report. Oh, let me start that again. I'm John Noble Wilford, and I covered the Apollo missions for the New York Times. I have to bear in mind that in the late 1950s, we were in the midst of the Cold War, the competition between the free world and the Soviet Union.
Key part of that Cold War was the space race.
This is John Wolfram, Navy diver, what we used to call a frogman.
We were in a fierce competition with the Russians, and the Russians got ahead.
Yeah, John's right. Of course, in a sense, it all began with Sputnik.
I was over in Asia at the time, and I landed my Saberjet fighter, and my crew chief said, you know, the Russians launched a Sputnik. I said, what the hell's a Sputnik? He said, well, it goes around the Earth, and it goes beep, beep, beep. And I said, okay, so what?
The Russians launched Sputnik in October of 1957. This was a blow to American egos. We thought we were the capital of technology in the world, but here the Russians were, beating us in a very crucial area. So there was consternation in the land, and this led to the formation of NASA in 1958.
In the early days, a lot of crazy ideas came out of the closet as to what characteristics a potential astronaut should have. Oh, hello there. I'm Mike Collins. I was the command module pilot aboard Apollo 11.
We'll get to that, of course, but later on.
Some people said, well, there's no air up there, so you want to get a mountain climber. Other people said, oh, no, it's dangerous. Let's pick a bullfighter. At about that time, someone put a piece of paper on the desk of President Eisenhower. It said the best possible candidates would be graduates from an accredited test pilot school. So that took a cast of millions and put it down to just a couple hundred.
The first Americans flew in the Mercury capsules, which had room for only one pilot. They started with 15-minute flights, 1 or 2 orbits around the Earth. This was the first step.
Well, you're talking to somebody who was in the original Mercury selection of 32 people who went for their physicals back in '58. I was the only guy to flunk the physical.
This is Jim Lovell. He was the command module pilot of Apollo 8 and the commander of Apollo 13.
I really think that those doctors couldn't pass all 32 of us. They had to flunk somebody. I was the guy. Now, the thing is, any candidate who wants to be a good astronaut has to look at the environment. All the possible problems that you can have going into space.
Well, they were, early on, they were worried. Like, will our bodies even work in space? We're humans. We've never been without gravity. What will people be able to swallow? And will they be able to urinate?
Mary Roach here is a New York Times best-selling author who writes about science. At 10 years old, she and her parents watched the moon landing. It made such an impression on her, she strove to become an astronaut.
That's true.
But it didn't work out.
No, but thank you for bringing that up. There was also concern about your mental state. I mean, once you left Earth behind, would your social system fall apart? Would your mind be blown? Would it be just too frickin' weird?
It's a hostile environment. We're not meant to be there. If you want to be in the space program, you're going to be putting your life at risk.
In 1961, 2 things happened. The Bay of Pigs was a disaster, this invasion of Cuba by Cubans trained by the CIA. And Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit Earth, a Russian. It was a 1-2 punch. President Kennedy had to do something. On September 12, 1962, at Rice University in Houston, Texas, Kennedy gave his speech.
This country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Many years ago, the British explorer George Mallory, who died on Mount Everest, was asked why he wanted to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
I thought it was a masterpiece of simplicity. Put a man on the moon at the end of the decade, return him safely here. Bingo. We had our marching orders.
Look, you gotta understand, we were committing to do something we had no idea how to do. We're talking the early 60s. Cordless phones didn't even exist yet. Oh, they were gonna have to figure out how to make better rockets, computers, spacesuits, and completely invent a whole new kind of spaceship.
I was a fighter pilot in Germany when Kennedy gave that speech.
This is Charlie Duke. He went to the moon as part of Apollo 16.
My first thoughts were, man, that is a bold statement. We got 15 minutes in space, and he's committing us to go to the moon in 8.5 years? Wow.
Charlie grew up in South Carolina.
When I was Capcom on Apollo 11, everybody from South Carolina, they called me and said, with your accent, that's the first time I ever understood what was going on. In the old days, the spacecraft were called capsules. Capcom is an acronym for Capsule Communicator. Every flight, every word spoken from mission control to the crew is via the Capcom, who was always an astronaut. Now, Capcom is underneath the flight director, of course, and the flight director makes the final decision.
A flight director has one of the simplest job descriptions in America. It says, the flight director may take any actions necessary for crew safety and mission success, period. During the course of a mission, there is no higher authority.
This is Gene Kranz.
That is affirmative.
After an illustrious career in the United States Air Force...
You know what? I will take it from here. My name is Gene Kranz. I started as an assistant flight director for Mercury. I was lucky to be at the right place at the right time with the right background.
In those days, most of us were military pilots.
Before I went into NASA, I spent 4 years as a Navy test pilot.
I was a test pilot, too.
We flew airplanes, did dangerous things, and we lived through it.
Yeah, well, in the beginning, you really wanted a dick-swinging, macho, fearless fighter pilot kind of guy. You know, who would be like, yeah, strap me into an exploding bomb. Send me up there. I got no problem with that. I mean, these guys, they'd flown experimental jets. They had nerves of steel, and that's who you wanted. They were chosen for that.
At the conclusion of the Mercury program, I was made a Gemini flight director.
The purpose of the Gemini program was to iron out all the problems that we might have going to the moon. We had to know how to rendezvous, how to dock, how to stay in space under zero gravity for at least 2 weeks. There was a lot that had to be ironed out before we did Apollo. In '62, the Navy said, "We need more astronauts. Do you want to apply again?" So I said, "Sure." This time, I passed. And that was the beginning of my space career. Gemini was a very small spacecraft, by the way. It was like being in a Volkswagen. When Frank Borman and I landed after the 2-week mission for Gemini 7, we announced that we were engaged.
Well, I look at this as going back to my childhood.
This is Margaret Hamilton.
Having talks with my father and my grandfather, we'd always ask, what if? Why not? I learned to question things.
Margaret was the engineer who led the development of the onboard flight software for the moon missions.
And I happened to write something called the priority alarm displays.
Which were very important, but we'll get to them later.
After I graduated college, I took my first job at MIT as a mathematician. During this time, they were advertising for people who could write software to take a man to the moon.
Okay, so case in point. Not only did we not have the software to do this, software as a thing had barely been invented. There were people in NASA who thought software meant soft clothing, as in, I love how your shoes match your software.
I had 2 interviews. One position was to work on hardware simulation. The other was for the onboard flight software. I interviewed with them on the same day, and they both offered me the job. I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings, so I said to them, well, you decide. They flipped a coin. The coin toss went my way, and the rest is history.
It was a generational thing. We grew up in the Depression. We went through World War II, Korea, then Vietnam. We had a relationship where we shared things. We liked good whiskey, we smoked a lot, and we were brothers.
Women were really in the minority. We were more an oddity than we were a threat. Well, sometimes they treated us like a mascot.
You ever play sandlot or hockey with a whole bunch of little kids? That was sort of the way it was. We were learning by doing stuff we'd never done before.
We were in a field that hadn't become formal, so we taught ourselves.
I love the job. I love the opportunity to take and make them, just weld them together, make them in.
Mercury led to Gemini, and then came Apollo, the program designed to send men to the moon and return them safely home.
I was one of the flight directors for the Apollo 1 mission. On Friday afternoon, January 27, 1967, my team and I were in the consoles.
The 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were going through a dress rehearsal on the launch pad. Suddenly, fire broke out in the capsule. It took approximately 5 minutes for workers to force open the hatch.
3 of my friends died in that fire.
No, I don't talk about that.
It was the darkest hour in the Apollo program.
Those 3 guys died because the program was moving too fast. Flight control, technicians, politicians, they were all gripped with this fever. Gotta get it done. Gotta beat the Russians to the moon.
The investigation revealed the wiring inside the cockpit was faulty and that the atmosphere in the capsule was pure oxygen. At the first spark, the air inside burned hotter than 1,000 degrees. The fire exposed how much of the program was slipshod and dangerous.
If that fire hadn't happened, I know damn well we would never have succeeded. Too many things were wrong. Management, people, hardware.
They made hundreds of changes to the spacecraft. Then they started again.
We'd seen friends killed throughout our careers, so the motivation that we had was, let's fix this and press on. It was never, I give up, it's too dangerous. Nobody had that. After Apollo 1, the next flights were tests of the rockets and tests of the command module unmanned. Those flights were to check out the Saturn V to make sure our rocket and the basic spacecraft were okay. Then we got to Apollo 7, the first manned flight.
The astronauts' lives were at stake. You had to make sure there were no errors in the software system, but you also needed to be sure that if there was an error on a real mission, you could detect it and recover from it.
The second of those manned missions, Apollo 8, came in the Christmas season of 1968. 1968, as anyone who lived through it can tell you, was a horrific year.
It was a crazy time to be a young person.
Of course, the big thing was the Vietnam War.
Before I became a frogman, I did a tour in Vietnam. Then I came home and things here seemed even worse. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated.
Everything that could go wrong was going wrong. Campuses were occupied, cities were burning.
But the space program, it was like this weird bubble of calm. The world's going to hell, and they're just, hunkered down with their sharpened pencils and buzz cuts.
8 weeks after Dr. King's murder, Robert Kennedy was assassinated.
In the midst of all this, 3 astronauts set out to circumnavigate the moon.
To me, Apollo 8 was the riskiest mission NASA had ever undertaken. It was the first time we had people on board the Saturn V. It was the second time we had people in the command module. We were committing these guys, and once they left Earth orbit, it had to work. If it broke in a serious way, they were not going to survive.
Frank Borman was the commander, Jim Lovell the command pilot, and the other astronaut was Bill Anders.
I ended up on Apollo 8, not flying it, but being the Capcom.
I always felt sorry for Mike. I was his backup on 8. He had a physical problem, which required an operation, and I took his place. Then again, he took my place on 11, so there's that.
For the first time in human history, people were going to leave this dinky little planet's orbit. We were going all the way to the moon.
The pictures of Earthwise, to me, very motivating, very moving.
For the first time, pictures of Earth as seen from the moon.
I expected 8 to be a good flight, a successful flight, but I did not expect it to recite from the Bible.
Borman, Lovell, and Anders circled the moon 10 times. Late Christmas Eve, on one of their final orbits, Anders announced,
"The crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you."
While a camera focused on the moon outside the spacecraft window, Anders read the opening words from the book of Genesis.
"In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep.
As millions listened, Lovell took over.
And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night.
Then Borman closed the reading.
And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good."
A hushed audience throughout the lands of Earth heard Borman sign off from the moon. Those who believe in other gods or no God at all shared in the spirit of the moment. The message was like a gift of hope.
Hey, do you believe it? It was great. Oh, the return was great. Everybody was super happy.
The New York Times, December 26, 1968. National and foreign reactions yesterday to the success of the Apollo 8 mission were characterized by jubilation, awe, and praise.
Jack Simpson of Los Angeles watched the return to the Earth on television.
Wait, I mean, it's the most incredible thing I have ever witnessed.
In shops and offices where workers clustered around television sets or radios, there were cries of, "Thank God."
You can't underestimate the value of Apollo 8. It gave the country something to feel good about. It gave NASA the confidence that, yes, by golly, we're going to make it to the moon before the decade is out.
We got a good feeling about orbiting the moon. Then Apollo 9 went around the Earth to make sure the lunar module system was in good shape.
Houston, March 13th, 1969. The nation's space effort took a decidedly moonward turn today when the Apollo 9 astronauts brought their spacecraft to a smooth and accurate splashdown in the Atlantic Ocean.
Apollo 10 was basically, I wouldn't call it a dry run, but it was a simulated moon landing. We did every part of the procedure that would be required for the landing, except the landing.
And then, well, then we were ready.
Washington, January 9th, 1969. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration named today the 2 Americans who may become the first humans to set foot on the moon. They are Neil A. Armstrong and Colonel Edwin E. Aldrin, Jr., both veterans of space flights during the Gemini program.
Today, they and Lieutenant Colonel Michael Collins also flew in space during Gemini, who also flew during space in Gemini, were named as the crew of Apollo 11.
I was Neil's backup on 11, and I did everything he did to prepare. Sometimes I was thinking maybe he'd break a leg or something like that, but he didn't.
Apollo 11 will be sent to the moon. If all goes well, a lunar module will separate from the main craft and descend to the surface with Mr. Armstrong and Colonel Aldrin.
They will explore for about 21 hours, pick up samples of the moon, take pictures, and set instruments, which will be left behind.
They then will re-enter the lunar module and take off to rendezvous with Apollo 11, which will be waiting with Colonel Collins aboard.
Then the 3 astronauts will return to Earth.
Oh, look. There were going to be some serious indignities for these guys. There was no bathroom on Apollo 11, so they had to use a fecal bag in a small capsule with another guy right next to them. And remember, there's no gravity. So to get what NASA calls good separation between your skin and the bag, they had to use their fingers. What?
There's no necessary...
I like that.
Goodness gracious. There's about 15 phases of a lunar mission with specialization for each phase. Mission rules are critical. Our mission rules for Apollo 11 covered 218 pages. In life, there are ambiguities. In mission control, there is no ambiguity. There is go, no go, black or white.
Cape Kennedy, Florida, June 27th. Today, Apollo 11 astronauts practiced landing on the moon.
Meanwhile, a 14-pound pigtail monkey named Bonnie was selected to be launched tomorrow night to test the effects of long-duration flight on animals. If Bonnie should balk at the last minute, another monkey named Mouse is standing by.
2 days before liftoff, the 3 astronauts made their final public appearance. 3,000 reporters were covering the launch.
Cape Kennedy, Florida, July 14th. The 3 astronauts appeared on a nationally televised 30-minute interview.
Mr. Armstrong, there's been speculation about what the first man on the moon will say when he gets there. Will you prepare something ahead of time, or can we expect a spontaneous exclamation?
Well, certainly, nothing has been prepared for me, and our attention during the training period up till now has been focused on how to do the job and how to do it best, and not so much on what might be the emotions of the moment.
Colonel Aldrin, do you feel the public is putting too much hope on this landing?
Well, I think we're seeing the type of reaction that many of us were hoping for. A very enthusiastic public that has great confidence in what our nation stands for.
Buzz was a PhD. He was Mr. Rendezvous.
Buzz claims he was the one that perfected the rendezvous technique to the moon while he was at MIT. I said, okay, Buzz. Whatever.
His doctorate was about, lo and behold, bringing two vehicles together in space orbit.
Colonel Aldrin, is there anything about the lunar module that bothers you?
Well, we'd always like to have a bit more fuel, but I think that's a natural reaction of a pilot.
Colonel Collins, you'll be flying the command module around the moon for some 28 hours. Do you expect any difficulties in flying solo for that length of time?
No.
Mike Collins. Mike Collins was a steady-as-a-stick kind of guy. The other two were going to be down on the surface getting all the notoriety, but Mike, no. Mike's the guy who was going to get them home.
Do you gentlemen harbor any fear?
Fear is characteristic of a knowledge that there may be something you haven't thought of and feel that you might be unable to cope with. Our training has erased these possibilities, and I would say, as a crew, we three have no fear of launching on this expedition.
I mean, he was just unflappable.
Some people give your expedition an 80% chance of success. Do you agree with that?
I think that's a reasonable estimate.
I thought it was about 50-50. That we get everything done, landing, spacewalk on the moon, trip home. I thought we'd escape with our skin, but to bring the whole thing off, a lunar flight, it's a fragile daisy chain. One break in the chain. So we were very, I mean, I don't know about Neil or Buzz. We didn't talk about these things.
I'm profoundly moved by our nation's scientific achievements in space and by the heroism of these three astronauts.
Reverend Ralph Abernathy, head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, successor to Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr.
The moonshot is one of man's noblest ventures, but I have not come to Cape Kennedy merely to experience the thrill of this historic launch. I am here to demonstrate against the tragic and inexcusable gulf that exists between America's technological abilities and our social injustices.
The day before the launch, Abernathy and some 500 protesters marched to the Kennedy Space Center. As the world watched, they confronted NASA officials on the launch pad itself.
1/5 of our nation's population lacks adequate food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. The money for the space program should be spent to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, tend the sick, and house the shelterless.
I agree with and support your goals.
There on the launch pad in the rain, NASA Administrator Thomas Paine stepped forward.
If we could solve the problems of poverty in the United States by not pushing the button to launch men to the moon tomorrow, then we would not push the button. What we do here today is child's play compared to the human problems you so well articulate, but I hope you will hitch your wagon to our rocket, sir, so that together we will use the space program to spur the nation to boldly tackle these problems.
The men shook hands. Paine asked Abernathy to pray for the safety of the three astronauts, and the Reverend did so. Paine invited the Reverend and a number of protesters to join him and the rest of the program's senior staff to watch the next day's launch. These are the wee hours of the day. The summer air is warm and still, no heavier than usual for Florida.
The eastern sky is just starting to show light as I hit the road to go to Mission Control.
It's July 16th, 1969, the day that the country has been waiting for.
Arriving, several controllers pass in silence as I walk by. There's no conversation today.
On pad 39A, the mighty Saturn V rocket is being fueled. It is 100 times more powerful than those that took the Mercury flights into orbit. Its journey requires 1 million gallons of kerosene, liquid oxygen, and liquid hydrogen. Were there to be an explosion on this launch pad, it would detonate with the force of a small nuclear weapon.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We just passed 2-hour, 21-minute mark in our countdown, and we are proceeding at this time.
Buzz Aldrin took the center seat to join Neil Armstrong on the left and Mike Collins on the right. These were the positions they would fly at liftoff.
1 hour, 7 minutes, 25 seconds and counting. The estimate is more than 1 million persons are in the immediate area of Brevard County to watch the launch.
The crowd seemed endless.
3 minutes, 25 seconds and counting. We're still a go at this time.
The air hummed with excitement.
T-minus 60 seconds and counting.
It's been a real smooth countdown.
It feels good.
20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
The Saturn V rocket beneath me is an immense piece of machinery, 7.5 million pounds of thrust.
The blast beats your chest and shakes the ground you stand on.
The most powerful rocket technology that humankind has ever produced.
At 120 miles above the surface, the spacecraft entered Earth's orbit.
Jesus Christ, look at that horizon.
Isn't that something? Get a picture of that.
After one swing around the planet, the spacecraft separated from the Saturn V and began its 240,000-mile journey to the moon. 3 days and nights they traveled, with all of NASA counting each mile.
Apollo 11, Houston. This is Jim Lovell calling.
This is the commander.
This is the backup commander. Still standing by.
You've lost your chance to fly this one, Jim.
Okay, Neil. I concede. How does it feel to be airborne again, Buzz?
Well, I'll tell you, I've been having a ball floating around inside here, back and forth.
As we closed in on our destination, we had to rotate like a chicken on a barbecue spit. Otherwise, one side of the spacecraft would freeze, the other would boil. When we got close, we turned around and looked. And there that thing was. Filled up the whole window. An amazing, amazing thing.
What a spectacular view.
Once they got into lunar orbit, the two spacecraft prepared for separation. Neil and Buzz went into the lunar module. Mike stayed in the command module.
The two spacecraft were quite different. The fragile, lightweight craft that Neil and Buzz flew to the lunar surface was called Eagle. And the gumdrop-looking command module, 60 miles above them, that was called Columbia. It was my happy home while Neil and Buzz were on the surface. I had this beautiful little domain, hot coffee, music. I was the emperor.
The mission had reached a critical juncture. Now each step would be more perilous than the last.
Apollo 11, Houston, you're looking good for separation. You are a go for separation, Columbia. Over.
Columbia understands.
With the lunar module behind the moon, I directed my controllers to a private loop used only for debriefings. Only my team heard my words. Today is our day. We have worked long hours, and we have had some tough times, but we have mastered this work. You are a hell of a good team, one I am privileged to lead. The control room doors locked. No one would enter or leave that room until we had landed, aborted, or crashed.
Columbia, Houston, we're standing by. Over. Columbia, Houston, over.
Houston, Columbia, read you loud and clear. How me?
Roger, 5-5, Mike. How'd it go? Over.
Listen, babe, everything is going just swimmingly. Beautiful.
Great. Eagle, Houston, if you read, you're a go for powered descent. Over.
Roger.
Radar on.
Got the Earth straight out our front window.
At 4 minutes, 40 seconds, data just dropped out. They were descending 132 feet per second, 50 miles from the landing site.
Then the computer started giving us alarms.
Program alarm. It's a 1202.
When I was working on the software, I realized we needed a way for the onboard computer to alert the astronauts if there was a problem. Can we hear that again?
Radar on.
Right there. When he changed the setting on the radar, the computer suddenly, unexpectedly, got overloaded. It didn't have the memory capacity to run the radar and the landing procedure at the same time. That's a problem. Well, now there's something called priority alarm displays.
Which, as you may remember, Margaret created.
They interrupt the astronauts' normal displays to warn them when something is wrong.
1202.
In this case, the alarm was to tell them to turn the radar switch off.
What is it?
They knew it was an emergency, but not what kind.
We had no idea what the 1202 meant, but it was telling us we had to choose, go or no go. All the while, Eagle was descending.
There in Mission Control, they had these cheat sheets with all the possible never supposed to happen alarms to explain what they meant and how to address them.
Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm.
Everyone waited in Eagle, in Columbia, in Mission Control, while programmers raced to determine what the 1202 alarm meant and would they have to abort the landing. 11 seconds passed.
We are still go.
Roger.
And they quickly relayed to Armstrong to turn the radar switch back off as Eagle continued its descent.
Then Neil saw his landing spot for the first time. It wasn't where we thought it would be. He was flying into a big boulder field.
Pretty rocky area.
Armstrong steered beyond the designated landing site for 2 or 3 more minutes and finally found a place that was clear of big boulders. But now, the fuel assigned for landing was dangerously low.
350 feet, down at 4. 330, 3.5 down.
Okay, how's the fuel?
8%.
It was dead silent in Mission Control.
I've been known to describe it as sheer terror.
Okay, it looks like a good area here.
3.5 down, 220 feet, 13 forward.
Going to be right over that crater.
5% fuel remaining. Okay, 75 feet.
They had only seconds left to land, or they would turn back.
60 seconds.
40 feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. Drifting to the right a little.
30 seconds.
Drifting forward just a little bit. That's good.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
That was in the coolest voice. That was in the coolest voice I had ever heard.
At the time we landed, we thought we had 17 seconds of fuel remaining.
Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Columbia, Eagle is at Tranquility. Over.
Yeah, I heard the whole thing.
Good show.
Fantastic.
Now, here's something a lot of people don't know.
The hatch is coming open.
When Neil started to climb out the hatch, what with the small door and the big spacesuit, he couldn't get out. Buzz had to direct him.
Okay. Your back is up against the... now it's on top.
It was like backing up an 18-wheeler.
Yeah. A little bit toward me. To your left a little bit. No, you're catching the first hinge.
The what hinge?
All right. Move. It's roll to the left. Okay. Now you're clear. You're lined up on the platform. Put your left foot to the right a little bit. Yeah, okay. That's good.
Okay. Houston, I'm on the porch. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LM foot pads are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Okay, I'm going to step off the LM now.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Houston, Monday, July 21st, men have landed and walked on the moon.
We astronauts, we all wanted to be the first one to land on the moon. But when Neil finally accomplished that objective, we thought, job well done.
That looks beautiful from here, Neil.
It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
Those first few steps, you're overcome by the beauty of it. You keep thinking, hey, wow, I'm on the moon. As you walk, you can feel a slight depression. Moon dust clings to your boots and gloves, sticks to your suit.
The spacesuits, that's so cool. 21 layers of fabric, strong enough to stop a small meteorite.
Somehow, the dust gets in your mouth. You can taste the moon. Tastes like gunpowder. Smells like it too. Like someone just fired a carbine. With all your equipment on, you only weigh 60 pounds, so you can jump real high.
Oh, I watched them with my parents. Armstrong and Aldrin moving across the moon. They were like kangaroos hopping in slow motion. It was amazing.
How many orbits did I make around the moon when they were down there? Someone told me 40, 41. That sounds about right. I wasn't keeping track. I had a lot of housekeeping to do.
Neil and Buzz, President Nixon's in his office now and would like to say a few words to you. Over.
That would be an honor.
All right. Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you from the White House. This certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure they too join with Americans in recognizing what an immense feat this is. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the sea of tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to earth.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin deployed the American flag on the surface of the moon. We had fulfilled our pledge to the crew of Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee.
After 21 hours on the lunar surface, Armstrong and Aldrin left Tranquility Base.
Tranquility, this is Houston. Everything is go.
Houston, Roger, we're number 1 for the runway.
The link I'm most worried about was their ascent from the lunar surface back to me in the command module. Around my neck, I had a little rope with an 8x10 book of rendezvous. 18 different situations for what to do if things go wrong. Because if we couldn't link up, I was coming home by myself. And that would not have been a good trip.
The rendezvous was executed perfectly. Now, with Armstrong and Aldrin back on board, Columbia headed home.
Columbia, Roger. How's it feel to have some company again?
Damn good, I'll tell you.
We heard on the news today when you made your landing last night, the New York Times came out with the largest headline they'd ever used in the history of the newspaper. Men walk on moon.
Save us a copy. I'm glad to hear it was fit to print.
And that guy there, he wrote that headline.
Yeah, him.
Yeah.
That guy.
Actually, it was that guy there.
The moon is 240,000 miles away from Earth, but the corridor you must enter in the atmosphere above the Earth is only 40 miles high. If we came back into that 40-mile corridor at too shallow an angle, we'd go right on by the Earth and be gone. If we came in at too steep an angle, we'd burn up. So we had very, very narrow limits, and that held our attention all the way back.
The night of July 23rd, there were storms in the Pacific, and NASA moved the splashdown site 250 miles away.
Once again, John Wolfram, Navy diver.
All through the night, my ship, the USS Hornet, steamed toward the new location as me and the rest of my team of frogmen prepared for the recovery of Apollo 11.
As you approach re-entry, you start to get this flashing outside the command module. The gas of the upper atmosphere is ionized and begins to glow as you accelerate at over 26,000 miles an hour.
As you plunge into the atmosphere, the spacecraft tries to bounce back out into space.
If you can imagine a really exciting roller coaster ride, re-entry is the same way, except outside it's a fireball, which you don't get in a roller coaster.
Early morning, July 24th. I'm standing in the door of the helicopter, staring up into the heavens. And then I see it. It looks like a shooting star.
At 23,000 feet above the ocean, the parachute sequence starts.
At 10,000 feet, the main parachutes deploy.
Then somehow it went behind the horizon and we couldn't see it till it landed in the water. I'm 20 years old, 2 years out of high school. My heart was beating. I knew I didn't want to make any mistakes. This was the day I was born for. I jumped into the water. I swam up to the capsule, grabbed a hold of that handle, and looked into the hatch. I saw Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Mike Collins. They smiled and gave me a thumbs up. They were okay. We got them into the raft, and they were flown back to the Hornet, where President Nixon and his team were there to greet them. They had made it home.
300 and some thousand Americans were working on Apollo in its prime. Little old ladies in Dover, Delaware, put together the pressure suits. They got at it with their scissors and their glue. If they hadn't done their work with 100% accuracy, when Neil stepped out onto the moon, instead of saying that's one small step, he'd have said whoops and been gone. Machinists, metallurgists, supervisors, up to the very top of NASA's chain. Everywhere you looked, there was competence and dedication.
We set out to honor President Kennedy's commitment to this nation. And by gosh, we did it.
It was started by Democrats and finished by Republicans. Government, private business, universities, they all had a hand in it. Completed on time and on budget. No one got rich, no one got indicted, and all of this, from Kennedy's speech to Armstrong's first step, and they did it in 8 years. 8 years! Think about that!
I look at Apollo 11 just like the building of the Panama Canal. It established a linkage between two great oceans and made the world a bit better.
I tell my grandchildren, your granddaddy was privileged to work in a program that gave the country a focus that united us instead of dividing us.
I have young people walk up to me and say, I wish we had something to be that excited about. Young people, old people, they tell me, we just want something we can wrap our arms around, that we can work on together.
After Apollo 11, Neil, Buzz, and I traveled to cities around the world. Everywhere we went, I expected people to say, well, you Americans finally did it. Instead, everywhere we went, we heard, we did it. We, humankind, did this wonderful thing.
American astronauts made 6 more journeys to the moon, but public interest was flagging. By the end of 1972, the last of the 12 men to walk on the moon packed up and returned home. That was 47 years ago. No one's been back since. But someday, a party of space travelers may make the pilgrimage to Tranquility Base. The encampment should be just as Armstrong and Aldrin left it, and the boot prints of where they first stepped should look like new.
The thing that I carry with me is not a remembrance of the moon, but how the Earth looks from 240,000 miles. It's blue and white, a little smear of tan or rust where the continents are. You would expect that, but what surprised me is how fragile it looks. I didn't think so much about that right then and there, but after we came back, I got worried about the fragility of the Earth. And I've carried that feeling with me for 50 years, because it's all we have. It's home.
We were privileged to live in that thin slice of history where we changed how man looks at himself and what he might become and where he might go.
That was amazing. Can we do that again? just a remarkable portrait of an ambitious time, just really wonderful. Having heard the story of our space program through JT's play, we now have the opportunity to hear from our astronauts themselves. In a moment, our own Michael Barbaro of The Daily will be here on stage to host a conversation with three living legends. Frances Poppy Northcutt began her career at NASA in 1965 as a return to Earth specialist on the Apollo program. With Apollo 8, she became the first female engineer to work in NASA's mission control. Later, she was in the Mission Control Center during the Apollo 10, 11, 12, and 13 missions. She was a member of the team that in 2009 received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for the rescue of Apollo 13. Peggy Whitson was the first woman to command the International Space Station in 2008, and she was commander again in 2013. She was NASA's first non-military chief astronaut, and she has spent more time in space than any other American, 665 days. Clearly, there is a reason why her NASA colleagues refer to her as the Space Ninja. Finally, we'll be joined by someone you've already heard from tonight. Major General Michael Collins flew in the Gemini and Apollo programs. And perhaps most memorably, he was the command module pilot for Apollo 11. 50 years ago tonight, he orbited alone around the moon for over 20 hours as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin made the first manned lunar landing. Thank you.
Okay, so before we really start, how did Jeff do?
Hell of a lot better than I did.
All right.
He was very good. He was very right on.
Good. Thank you, Dean, my boss. It's truly an honor to be on stage with you all. I don't think I've ever been this nervous to moderate anything. Living legends in every way. Your accomplishments are utterly mind-bending. And I think we're all really grateful to have you here. I'm going to start a little bit rudely by disclosing your ages. And there's a specific reason why I'm going to do this. Michael, you are 88, correct?
My piano keys, 88.
88, yes. Poppy, you are 75.
That's correct.
And Peggy, you are 59.
Yeah.
And baby. And the reason I mention that is because the three of you represent very different phases in the U.S. space program, as I think will become clear as we talk. I want to start with the newest character in our story here, and that is the two of you, Peggy and Poppy. Peggy, tonight's play ended with the moon landing. Where are you in your life at that moment?
So I was age 9, farm in Iowa. My parents and 2 brothers and a sister sitting in front of a TV watching black and white grainy pictures of the moon landing.
Mm-hmm. And thinking what?
Oh, I was definitely thinking, this has got to be one of the coolest jobs in the world. And actually, that is really, truly what was my inspiration in life and my desire to become an astronaut. It took an incredibly long time for me to make it eventually.
What do you mean?
Well, after I got my PhD in biochemistry, I applied to become an astronaut for over 10 years. I was working at NASA, but I did not become an astronaut until after 10 years of applying.
How many times did you apply?
They were having selections every 2 years then, so 5 times.
And they rejected you?
Yeah, pretty much.
But you were persistent.
Yes. We raised that on the farm in Iowa.
But you truly are inspired at the moment of landing. This man responsible for your career, not entirely, but in a kind of spiritual sense.
Very much so. It was truly that seed of inspiration for me. I think it was extremely beneficial. They happened to pick the first female astronauts the year I graduated from high school.
Mm-hmm.
And among them was Shannon Lucid. Also, she's a biochemist, and I was interested in going into biochemistry, so that made it seem like it was possible for me to really become an astronaut. So the dream changed to a goal.
Mm-hmm. I think, Michael, that many young boys and girls had the experience that Peggy, you did, which is watching the moon landing and thinking, oh my God, this is what I want to do. And of course, most of us don't, of course, end up doing that. If the moon landing inspired a generation, as it clearly did, Michael, what inspired you? How do you become inspired to join a space program when there is no Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong? What is your inspiration?
Well, people had different ways of coming into it. I had a stair-step sort of approach to it. I went into the Air Force because I thought that was an interesting career coming up. Learned to fly planes, smaller planes, fighters, test pilot. Space program came along just exactly as I crossed its path. So,
how old were you?
I don't know. I must have been 36, thereabouts. Or no, a little younger, 34, 5, something like that ballpark.
And as the space program and your air piloting worlds intersect, then what happens?
And it did what?
What happens after that? So you said the space program arrives just as you're becoming a pilot.
Yeah, well, I applied to NASA to be an astronaut. And the first time I applied, I flunked. I'm not sure why I flunked. I can think of a lot of very valid reasons why I did, but the one I remember is the psychiatric aspect of it. And, we had to read these Rorschach ink blots and decipher what they were. I don't know, I muddled all the way through it. Somehow the last one was a blank white sheet. And I studied it intensely, I'm sure, for a while, and and I said, well, of course, that's 11 polar bears fornicating in a snowbank. I thought that was mildly amusing, but I could see his face tightened, and he didn't want to hear that about his precious ink blots or whatever pages. So. The next year I came in, I saw my mother and my father. My father's a little bit taller than my mother, but very respectful of her. They were both very well dressed and looked humbly at the camera. So they took me that year.
But just to be clear, you didn't see your mother and father in the ink blot. You didn't see them in the ink blot. You actually saw them.
No, I'm sorry, I missed that. I'm definitely sorry.
I was being facetious. So interestingly, both of you have these pretty significant early on setbacks. Did you have one rejection, or did you have many rejections?
No, just the one. I hope.
And Poppy, what about you? What is your inspiration? What brings you to the program? And where is the program as you come into it?
Well, I was 22 years old. I just graduated from the University of Texas with a degree in mathematics. I went to Houston looking for work, and I ended up being hired by a contractor at NASA as a computress.
That was their word for it.
A gendered computer.
And what does a computress do?
Well, we crunched a lot of numbers and did a lot of graphs and so forth, and worked with the engineers who were working, in my case, working on doing software, developing the software for trajectories that were going to be used in, well, some were used in Gemini, but Apollo. Mm-hmm. So after I was there about 3 months, it occurred to me, looking around at these dudes that I was working with, that I was as smart as they were, and I knew they were getting paid a lot more than I was. So I decided I wanted to be a member of the technical staff, or an engineer as they called them. So I started working really, really, really hard. And I ended up being promoted and worked on the development of the Return to Earth program, which was used to bring the astronauts back to the Earth from the moon. And I never lost a client.
Did you ever get to fix that pay inequity?
Not completely. If you start behind, you never make it up.
Has it been fixed since?
Not, well, for people there now, hopefully. Although there's still a wage gap for women. And all the studies indicate it's still present. It's not as acute as it was, so it's improved, but it's still a problem.
So each of you entered the space program at a different moment, but one of the things you all share, as clear from your biography, is that there comes a moment in each of your career where you seem to basically do the impossible, something no one else has done before. Let's start with you, Michael. You said earlier that, well, you didn't say it, Jeff said it, but while your fellow astronauts, Buzz and Neil, are walking the moon, you do something like 40 or 41 trips around the moon. And I feel like you said that in the play very, very casually, just 40 or 41 cycles around the moon. But I want to go into that moment with you for just a little bit. It's been the three of you together on the ship, and now you're suddenly all alone. Tell me about that period when you were all alone on the command module.
The question I got when I got back to Earth, I thought was kind of ridiculous. It was, weren't you the loneliest man in the whole lonely history of the lonely planet in your lonely orbit? Behind the lonely moon, weren't you by yourself lonely? And I thought, God, no, I was enjoying myself. I had my own domain. I had hot coffee. I had music if I wanted. I had mission control yakking at me, but I could sneak around behind the moon and they would shut up because they were... I felt like a king, king on his throne, and that was my empire. Like all kings, I had to be a little bit wary, like fuel cell number 3 is acting up a little bit now. We'll have to do something about that. But in general, it was a happy home for me. I was very familiar with it. I was familiar with flying machines by myself, so that wasn't too strange. And I really trusted Neil and Buzz to be doing what they were supposed to do. It was a happy time for me all the way around.
You keep mentioning hot coffee as if that is somehow such a special gift to have on the ship, this hot coffee.
Absolutely. The cream and chicken soup wasn't bad either, but some of the other stuff was just god-awful, terrible. I could have used a chef.
Did you encounter any problems during that 40 or 41 rotations around the moon? Was it all just smooth?
No, everything went pretty smoothly. And I don't think they did either. That was the amazing thing. If you ask me what are my long-term recollections of Apollo 11, I have many of them, but one of the salient ones is, complicated as that was, and many gadgets as we had, all linked together. Thank you, Madam Engineer. I was just amazed by the fact that all these little pieces fit together perfectly. We didn't have any real problems with our equipment. And in that sense, the whole fragile daisy chain stayed intact. No links got even stressed badly, much less broken.
I think the reason people always ask if you're lonely or the loneliest lonely man to ever have walked the lonely earth in that period is really because what they want to ask is this question. So I'm going to ask it.
Sure.
Did you want to be on the moon with them? Did you wish that you were down there walking, putting those indelible footprints there?
No, not really. But first cousin to that, I mean, I certainly didn't think I had the best seat on Apollo 11. I knew I did not. But I was just delighted to have the seat that I did have. It was the culmination of John F. Kennedy's dream. I was, just had the luck of wandering in at exactly the right time. I was flying with two extraordinarily competent individuals. I had the world by the tail.
Mm-hmm. You did. Poppy, I want to turn to you. Your story, your defining story, not your whole story, takes place back on Earth. And you're part of this team in Houston, as we've heard, that rescues Apollo 13. Can you start at the moment before you realize that something has gone wrong with Apollo 13? What is happening in your world, at your desk?
Well, actually, I had just gotten back from Florida because I went down there and watched the launch of 13. That was the only launch I ever got to see. I didn't go to work in the control center until the spacecraft entered the moon's sphere of influence because I was a lunar specialist, very specialized functions that you have in the space program. So I was just recovering sort of from this flight back and from the tension of, are they going to actually launch 13? Because there had been a crew member who was sick and they had to replace him at the last minute. The launch, it was, is it going to go or not go? So I was, just back.
Mm-hmm. So when did you realize something was wrong?
I realized something was wrong when I got a call from a reporter.
Never a good thing.
I got a call from a reporter, and the reporter told me what had happened and wanted to know whether they're going to be able to just turn around and come back, or were they going to have to fly around the moon. And I just asked a couple of questions, and I said, they got to fly around the moon.
And so what does your role become during this crisis?
Well, I went into the center at that point, and that was sort of a funny thing, is I walk in, and the folks that I work with in the flight dynamics support room, they're very surprised and very happy to see me because they couldn't find my phone number. Which was sitting under the glass, okay, written in large letters, which might have indicated they were a little stressed.
Okay, so you're there. So once you get past the indignity of them not having called you, what is your hands-on role in the rescue?
Well, I mean, basically what we did was what our program was designed to do. People think that we must have done some dramatic kind of thing. Actually, what I worked on was the development of an abort program. The language was cleaned up for public consumption. It was called a Return to Earth program, but it was an abort program. Mm-hmm. So we had simulated doing all of these things We had simulated using the descent propulsion system to come home. We had simulated ad nauseum a lot of different contingencies. So we just did what we do, which is we calculated a return to Earth. We put the spacecraft on a free return trajectory because that was the first mission where it was not on one. And then the only real difference in doing a regular return was that instead of firing to speed up the return, instead of doing that on the backside of the moon out of communication, waited until communication was regained and then did the speed up maneuver at that point.
Was there ever a moment where you feared that you wouldn't be able to bring Apollo 13 back?
Yes and no. I mean, I had real confidence in the software. The big question was, what was the condition of the craft? And no one really knew that. I mean, that was the big unknown, is what exactly is the condition of that spacecraft. Mm-hmm. And they didn't really know until reentry, whenever they did separation and the crew got a load of what the back end of that craft looked like. Mm-hmm. But that was the whole thing. I knew that, if we had a working engine and we had, the dips, the descent propulsion system, I knew what kind of capability it was. I knew that our software was good at that point. But what's the condition of the craft?
In the end, what do you think the importance of that moment was for the space program, bringing Apollo 13 back?
No disrespect to Mike and the people on Apollo 11, but to me, Apollo 13 was the most successful mission. Okay?
What do you mean?
Well,
I understand what you're saying, yeah.
It was the most successful mission. I have no doubt about that in my mind. I think Apollo 8 was the most challenging mission. Mm-hmm. I think Apollo 11 was the most gratifying mission in many ways. But Apollo 13 was the most successful mission because it demonstrated that we could recover from a devastating emergency. And while we didn't fulfill all of the mission objectives, despite having a real disaster on board, and I'm talking a biggie, we fulfilled the ultimate requirement, which is you get them home alive. Because the most important footprint is not the one on the lunar surface. It is the one that is made when they get on board that recovery ship. And I never forgot that.
So Peggy, as Dean said in his introduction, you have spent more time in space than any American, which is incredible. And most of it was on the International Space Station. And I'm struck in having you here on stage with Michael, who represents this inspiration for you wanting to be in the program. What an incredible distance we travel from landing on the moon, what it meant for that brief moment, and coming right back. And you basically living in outer space. And so my first question to you is, does it ever get normal living in space?
Actually, yeah, it does. And it was actually kind of an eye-opening moment for me. One morning I woke up, I was in my sleeping bag hanging on the wall and checking the
slow down, sleeping bag on the wall.
Yeah, of the space station. And I was checking my messages that had come up from the ground team the night before, and I printed off a couple things, and I floated out to the end of the lab and at the other end to pick up the paper off the printer, and I'm like, I live in space. It really is amazing when it becomes your home, when you really truly adapt to the place. And it's hard because without gravity, you don't realize how much everything in your life is ruled by gravity. You know, the water sits on the thing, this sits on the floor, the chairs sit on the floor, we sit in the chairs. All these rules of gravity are gone.
Right.
And you have to, change that whole mindset and live in a place where everything floats and adapt to that. And it's actually really unique and it's freeing in a lot of ways, in many senses.
How is it freeing?
Well, freedom of motion, freedom of movement, just it's really exciting to learn to live in an environment so completely different than the one you've been raised in,
Mm-hmm.
that you've adapted to your whole entire life and you didn't even realize you had.
So each day you wake up on the ISS, the International Space Station, and what are you hoping to accomplish in a given day there?
Every day's different, which is actually why I think it's so much fun. We do all different kinds of science. I did everything from growing soybeans, which my dad grows on the farm, to growing superconductor crystals under different conditions, growing stem cells, all a huge variety of physical and chemical and biological properties that we're studying in space. So the science is amazing. Mm-hmm. But then there's all the cool operational stuff that we get to do, the spacewalks. There's nothing that beats going out in your little spaceship built for one to do some tasks. And it's one of the most stressful in the sense that, there's always something broken or you have to fix something or do something very important while you're out there because we don't do that lightly. Mm-hmm. And so it's stressful, but it's also the most gratifying thing that we do out there too. So all of it, every day, because of the variety, I really am always been satisfied, very gratified by the privilege of being able to keep the space station running, even if I have to fix the toilet.
And you do have to fix the toilet.
I've done it many times.
So what feels more like home to you now, there or here?
I like the up there home better.
You did?
Yeah, gravity kind of sucks.
Gravity isn't the only thing that sucks about Earth. And by popular request, what do you miss most when you're back on Earth? What do you miss most about space?
Space, floating, that new environment, that different environment. That's the part I miss the most.
It sounds like you've gotten kind of philosophical about not just gravity, but maybe what it means to not be on Earth.
Oh, absolutely. I think the biggest thing that I think changed in me anyway was that perspective that Mike talked about, looking back at the Earth. And, on the space station, we were obviously a lot closer to Earth, and so it's a much bigger part of our view. Mm-hmm. But you have this sense of frailty. I think that's a good word. You see this thin little atmosphere that's protecting it. We're synthetically trying to build an ecosystem that does all the same things that planet Earth is doing for us in a very natural way. And we're trying to build it so that we can go these other places. And it gives you a huge respect for what's here on spaceship Earth that's keeping us alive. But the other thing is, looking out to the stars, looking the other direction and seeing thousands and thousands and thousands of stars just in our little old galaxy, and recognizing that there's billions of other galaxies. Mm-hmm. It just gives you this sense of being less than even a grain of sand on the beach of the cosmos, a kind of sense. Very important, but at the same time, so small.
So I want to ask all three of you about the current state of the space program. So much has been accomplished in the years since the moon landing. But there's a lot of discussion on this 50th anniversary about the fact that we haven't been back to the moon in 47 years, as was said in the play. And we haven't put humans in other worlds. And so much of what it seems is happening now in the space program is very technological and doesn't seem to be as focused on human exploration and frontier breaking for its own sake. And I wonder what you think about that. Is that assessment correct?
I would disagree. in part because the work that we're doing on board the space station is going to help keep those astronauts, those future astronauts, whether they're going to the moon or to Mars, alive in those situations. For instance, we can't take enough water with us. And so one of the things we do on board the space station is we recycle everything. So we're recycling condensate, we're recycling the urine, we're recycling all the water. We've got it up to about 85%. Wow. But if you think about that, going to Mars, you know, we either have to clean up what water's there or recycle everything that we've got. And they're testing a new one a new device that'll hopefully get up around 95%. That's just one example of the technology that is being developed, tested, and fine-tuned so that we'll be able to make that trip safer.
Mm-hmm. Michael, why haven't we gone back to the moon?
Before I answer that, I want to pick up on Peggy's experience. I flew before Apollo 11 on a Gemini flight with John Young. Very interesting flight. I loved it. We did 2 or 3 EVAs, you know, spacewalk. Neither term is very descriptive, but whatever you want to call them, we did 2 or 3 things, and it took me outside the spacecraft for maybe, I don't know, I'm guessing maybe 2 hours and 15 minutes. Peggy spent 60 hours outside the vehicle. That just shows you the difference, how far we've come, how much more complex it has gotten, and my hat's off to you. I don't think I'd want to be out there for 60 hours. Now, true. Well, thank you. I was in the White House. I don't normally go to the White House, but I was in the White House yesterday or the day before, and President Trump touched briefly on space and explained very briefly about returning to the moon, using that as a gateway to Mars. And he was there right here. He turned to me and he said, "Collins, what do you think?" I said, "Mars direct." So.
You told the president no stopping on the moon.
That's
on
correct.
The way to Mars.
That's correct.
That sounds like something that might appeal to him.
What?
What was his response?
Oh, he just went on with his next. He was very graceful. He went on with his next question to someone else. Later on, he did tell his people they should maybe look at different approaches. So I don't know if that had anything to do with what I said or not. But no, I think a lot of thought has gone into this gateway of going back to the moon, constructing an orbit, a vehicle to traverse that orbit that would assist you, be pointed at Mars, assist you along the way, it'd give you a base of operations. You could perhaps pick up some, on the backside of the moon, some material that could be converted into rocket fuel partially and off, so it would be a better thing in many ways. My friend Neil Armstrong, who is a lot better engineer than I, didn't know anything about Gateway. He died about close to 5 years ago. But he did tell me a time or two that he thought going to Mars had our knowledge had some gaps in it, and that perhaps those gaps could be filled by a precursor mission to Mars. I don't know specifically what he would have thought about this Gateway thing. But as I say, I think a lot of intelligent thought has gone into it. I just prefer a JFK a JFK Martian Express. The same structure that launched us to the moon. President Kennedy's directive to us was a masterpiece of brevity, and it helped us along the way. It gave us a tremendous focus on the moon. By the end of the decade, we get people to work harder and faster and get things going more, and their motivation, I felt, was whetted by the fact that this very specific thing that we wanted to do. And I think that's what you need in the next big venture in space, is to get the American public behind that venture, get some enthusiasm on their part. And about 20 minutes into the briefing on Gateway, I've kind of lost exactly what it is they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And I just have a vision of, I see them saying, of course we're going to go to Mars, but in the meantime, the gateway has to, it has to be, the Francis doesn't fit in the umlaut quite right, and so on and so on. I just think it's going to delay things, and I'd rather shoot directly for Mars.
But what Michael raises is your belief that you need a president and a government and just a systemic focus to get something like this done. What we had with Apollo, what we had with your mission, was a kind of geopolitical competition. We had Russia, Soviet Union, we had Sputnik. We don't have that now, and the centrality of the space program is not what it was then. And I see you nodding. So do you think it's possible we have these kind of breakthroughs in the absence of that kind of pressure?
I think you've overlooked something else that we do not have, that we had then. And that is that we had Lyndon Baines Johnson for 6 years. And while he was not charismatic by any stretch of the imagination, and he was not a brilliant speaker, and he was not young and dynamic, and all of those things that he was not, there was one thing he was, and that was he was a master of the Senate and of the process of getting money. Mm-hmm. And he brought home the bacon for 6 years.
To NASA.
We have to have money, okay? We have to have money to do these great things. And we have to have somebody who can go in and work their will with the Congress, and I don't see it. I wish I did, but I don't see it. I would love to see, Mars Direct sounds good. I sort of differ with Mike, because I probably worry more about the health of the astronauts than the astronauts do. But I think part of the success for Apollo was that we did things very incrementally, and you could see how we were building successfully. We will probably have loss of life, okay? And that's part of what comes with space flight. It's a very hazardous thing. But we have to do everything that we can to make it as safe as we can, and that means having the patience to do it right. You gotta just do it right, do it right, do it right. And we're a long way from, we don't even have a launch vehicle right now. So we have a lot of steps to make up. Mm-hmm. We don't have a craft right now. We don't have a lander. We don't have we don't have a lot of stuff. And I agree with Mike that the clearness, the clarity of Kennedy's mission was very valuable. But we've also got to find the money.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you're saying we also need a functioning government. Michael, I have to ask you a little bit more about this meeting with the president. Did you find yourself believing that President Trump's commitment to space was genuine? Did you think this is something he's going to...
Yes, I did.
There it is. I want to end, Peggy, with you, because clearly what we're getting at here is, does the space program have a future as glorious as its past, or is the most glorious phase behind us? And I kind of want to return to the 9-year-old girl on the farm, and does she dream about space now? Does she dream of becoming an astronaut? Not just you, but all the 9-year-old girls on all the farms and non-farms. Or is the dream something different now because of what we've just talked about, because the program doesn't hold the place that it once did?
Well, it's definitely changed, and I think, you know, it's hard to have the public interested in something that we're doing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the last 20 years on board the International Space Station. We can't hold the public's interest. Just like Apollo got canceled after 6 flights. So in general, it's not going to hold the public interest. But I think where we are in space right now, if we build an infrastructure, we will get the commercial companies buying in more and more. And I think we're kind of at a tipping point where we could really go places. I think with the commercial partners, with international partners, it's going to take all that, because we are not going to get that 5.5% of the budget that we had back in the 60s. Mm-hmm. You know, we're less than 0.5% now, and it's, you know, it's going to take a lot more finesse to do these big things. So we are definitely in a different place, but I think young people still find space inspirational, and we keep trying to expose folks to it as much as we can.
I want to thank the 3 of you, Poppy, Peggy, Michael. But before you go, before you stand up and even think of leaving this room, we have a final installment of our program, a very special message that I want you all to watch.
Hello, New York City, and hello, Town Hall. I'm NASA astronaut Nick Hague with my NASA crewmate, Christina Cook, flying 250 miles above the Earth on the International Space Station.
Tonight, on the 50th anniversary of the departure of the lunar module Eagle from Tranquility Base, all of us here want to join you in paying tribute to the men and women who made history a half-century ago and who pioneered human space exploration. Here's to the next 50 years in space and to all we will learn and accomplish together.
From the International Space Station, thank you, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.